So we'll be back in a minute after this video talking about scaling and expanding energy tech. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
A major hurdle impacting European energy startups and scale-ups is permits. Depending on the country, permits in Europe can take 3 to 4 years to receive, whereas the global average is 6 to 9 months. Other problems persist as well: financing, supply chain, and societal acceptance, to name a few. The energy industry also faces unique challenges, such as regulatory complexity. How does this affect companies expanding into new markets? We will discuss the challenges and benefits these companies face in our next panel, Scaling and Expanding Energy Tech.
Welcome back, and we're already up to the last session of the day. The day has flown by. It's been a whirlwind of lots of insights, so and a lot of engagement from the audience, so thank you for all the questions. For our final discussion today, we're talking about scaling and expanding energy tech. And to discuss that, we have Milan van der Meulen, who is the founder of Soly. Milan's journey with renewable energy began when he was 13 years old and saw Al Gore's documentary An Inconvenient Truth. Since then, he's dedicated his life to making a positive impact on the planet, which included founding the solar energy company Soly alongside his brother 10 years ago. Milan, pleasure to have you here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and also thanks for doing the right pronunciation of my last name.
Yes, nailed it. We also have Doreen Rietentiet, CCO and co-founder of gridX. Doreen began her career as an international journalist and joined the renewable energy sector in 2005. She co-founded one of Europe's first climate tech boutique consultancies, which helps corporate startups and VCs in the climate tech space stand out with the right strategies, policies, and efficient communication and PR. Doreen, welcome to the panel.
Hi, and thank you for having me. And I also have an Al Gore connection because I brought Al Gore for the first time to Germany to meet former UNEP director Klaus Töpfer. And at that point, he didn't even know what Germany was all doing in the renewable sector. So funny connection there.
Thank you very much for introducing that. I've got more connections than we even realized. Yeah. And of course, you've probably noticed the man sitting next to me again, Tim Steinmetz. As you may know, CGO, Chief Growth Officer and Managing Director at gridX. Tim is on a mission to disrupt the energy sector with innovative approaches and agile, customer-centric, hands-on teams. He's been the CGO of gridX since 2019 and took on the role of Managing Director at the beginning of this year. Tim, welcome back.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Greta.
All right, so let's dive straight in. First question, I'll direct to Milan. What are the challenges of scaling an energy tech or climate tech startup, particularly in Europe?
Yeah, so if that also involves indeed scaling to other countries, then I think one of the biggest and most important elements is that you have a certain blueprint of the company, and for us that involves having our own tech in-house. For example, we developed a platform that really enables us to continue growth. And then in the end, you enter countries, and of course you have to do some local adjustments that can be based on regulations. Sometimes there's a subsidy in a certain country or a certain process that is not really suitable to have in a certain country. So it's about adjusting it a bit. But I think having a very good blueprint, sometimes it also feels like having a franchise organization in that sense. Of course, 90% of your basic operation is similar. And then that last 10%, that is some localization you have to do. And in that sense, it feels like a franchise organization. But then, of course, every country has its own uniqueness, and you have to be adaptive on that as well.
Thanks, Milan. We're going to unpack a bit of that in a second. But Doreen, what about more specifically bureaucratic processes in scaling a company in Europe? How could this process be improved? And do you have any kind of personal experiences with that?
Not me personally, but I work with a lot of founders who do. And we recently actually had an event at the UK Embassy with our initiative, Women in Climate Tech and Innovation. And we had some founders there who have founded in the UK simply because of the reason that Germany is way too complicated with the whole bureaucratic backbone behind it. Although there is a new development today in the Bundestag, there will be some changes coming up. I think the Startup Association managed to get through, I forgot the name, it's a very complicated name, to make it easier to secure more risk investments also in Germany, which was always the problem. And I think, again, it depends on where you go as a startup and also what industry you're in. I think as a digital startup with the software you find in Germany, there's a lot of VC money there. If you are a hardware startup, it's a bit more complicated. There's not that much risk investment or risk investors. There are a few, thankfully, and a few more are popping up, but it's more in the US, UK, and elsewhere. And then also from a legislation point, for example, if you're a solar startup or something, France will roll out the red carpet for you at the moment, right? So it's I'm not saying it's easier, but there's definitely more commitment in the sector of energy in France at the moment. So it really depends on what area you're in, what industry you're in, and also what kind of investment you need. So yeah, and when it comes to diversity, Germany is still kind of on the back end of it, I have to say.
Tim, what are your thoughts on this? Germany's not bureaucratic, right?
I would say we love to complain about this, and there's also big truth behind. Does the bureaucracy stop us starting companies, scaling companies? I would say no, but it could be much easier, to be honest. So if you compare different countries also within Europe, I would rather say Germany is at the back, and also, as also Doreen just mentioned, with other regards, and we can learn a lot from our neighbors, to be honest, right? So to harmonize frameworks, to digitalize, to standardize, to even integrate when you found a company, different administrative bodies that you don't have to enter your data 20 times. So that would, I would say, reduce a lot of paperwork and also ease starting a company. And yeah, so reduced bureaucracy, I think, is an important thing to improve and facilitate even more companies which can start up.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And Milan, anything else to add from a Dutch perspective?
Well, I think indeed I can confirm that the Germany is quite bureaucratic, and I think that's also the reason why the coffee at notary office is also always that good, because you have to do a lot of waiting. Even this morning I went to a notary because we will expand to another country from January on. But I can tell you there are even countries that have a worse bureaucratic system compared to Germany. And instead of, because now we're focusing on the bureaucracy in entering a country and having your entity set up, but also in the operations side, there is a lot of bureaucracy in some countries. So for example, in the Netherlands, you can just install a system. It doesn't even have to be checked by some sort of independent authority. You can just enroll that system in a platform that then communicates it to all the grid operators so they know that there is a system that has been installed. If you compare that, for example, to countries like Belgium or Germany, the installation has to be tested by an independent organization. Well, I've done a lot of the grid operation infrastructure in terms of administration in Germany is very different compared to that of the Netherlands. And I think a lot of countries can also learn a bit from each other on that part to make it more efficient. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Tim, how much of a barrier is finding employees or talent in a scaling business?
It depends a little bit on the timing perspective, I would say. Nowadays, it's luckily, I would say, quite good because it's in a very attractive industry. But when I think back also in my history personally, like almost 15 years ago when I decided to join the energy industry, many friends and people looked at me like a stranger, right? So It was totally unsexy, to be honest. And yeah, basically the electricity comes out of a power socket and almost nobody cares what's behind, right? So it wasn't really emotional, the topic. And yeah, as said, I think nowadays it completely changed. The topic climate change is aware actually for everybody. So it's covered in media. We all know that we'll be affected by that. And in the end, that gave a huge push, and the people also want to have more impact in their jobs. So we see more and more talents joining from other industries, or when starting the first job, really thinking about where do I want to put my time into and where do I have the biggest impact. So luckily, that's getting better. On the other side, it's also still a very complex industry, and partly we need to have very specialized roles and person skill sets. So although it's getting better and it's more attractive than in comparison to a couple of years ago, I would say it can be very challenging to set up the right teams. And I think in one of the sessions before, for example, Jochen also mentioned that it's tough finding the right people. So I can definitely confirm that. Yeah.
And Doreen, what about in your experience more generally in the climate tech space? Do you think interest has increased in the last few years?
You mean interest in
Working.
people joining the climate working? Yeah. Okay, yes. Yes, funny enough, I also have a recruiting company called Climate Tech Talents, just founded a month ago. Yes, a lot of people that we know, for example, from the oil and gas sector, right, who are coming in, only starting now because obviously the salaries are becoming more competitive now, also in the renewable sectors, with companies who have really well funding or who are well funded. There are some unicorns out there as well. And funny enough, there is a lot of similarity. For example, if you look at the oil and gas sector and now the, let's say, geothermal lithium, right? I mean, it's kind of similar skill sets. And so you see people joining from the fossil industry into the renewable industry. You also have that in other industries who say, hey, you know what, I just had enough. Well, who realize now that even if you're working for a big corporate who is not really turning around the ESG criteria, or is not having a sustainability officer, which, by the way, is another topic, right? If sustainability is not taken seriously in companies, you will see people leaving and looking for companies who are not necessarily sustainable or climate tech, but who take that subject and reducing CO2 emissions seriously. So you have two movements, one from the fossil sector to the climate tech sector, but you have also within industries moving or people moving from companies who take climate action seriously and away from companies who don't.
And along the same kind of line of thought, Milan, have you noticed a shift in societal acceptance of new technology, specifically in the energy industry, in the last few years? And do you think that's still a barrier for scaling companies and rolling out new solutions?
Well, I think, by the way, I also agree with what previously said. I think the labor transition and energy transition go hand in hand with each other. And I think also COVID challenged us to have a different association with the work environment, but also in accepting new transitions, for example, like the energy transition. So what we've seen also in accepting like new technologies, well, I think we have seen the enormous peak in solar demand, for example, happening during COVID. People started to be more aware of that direct environment because they spend a lot of time in there. I think in terms of solar, well, batteries, products like these, I think they have gained big traction because of that. So I think there is a more acceptance. But what I also find a little bit more underlying is that people tend to strive to being more independent, right? Because of what we've learned of COVID, but also what is happening on the geopolitical level, that people tend to create a more independent way of living. And I think solutions that we currently have in energy, in the field of energy, I think that are also quite matching that demand that we see currently. So yes, I see a deeper level of acceptance of these kind of technologies.
Tim, do you want to add something there?
Yeah, maybe just switching a bit the perspective. So I personally think it's not really about accepting technology. It's about using, and I think the mass user, so to speak, naturally uses a new technology if he sees that a solution from his perspective is useful, right? So if he gets independent, like Milan said, or if the money in the pocket gets more, or we are feeling that the climate change is real and we feel it ourselves. So if I have a solution which is easy to understand, fulfills his needs, then I use it. And with that, I use the technology. So I would see it rather from the solution and product side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Doreen, anything to add there?
No, I mean, what we see is right now is really just generally this shift of people also wanting to, like, it's a generation thing. I'm not even sure if it's like fed up with fossil thing or I want to go into climate tech. I think that the younger generation generally, they have a complete different mindset when it comes to who I want to work for. And it has something to do, yes, you know, whether that company is kind of future proof. Are they looking into all these like sustainability criteria and stuff like that? But also it has a lot to do with work-life balance. That is way more on the agenda now than it was before, or like in the last generations. And that comes down to what Milan said. So it's about the traveling thing, but it's also about, I want to have the right culture in the company. What we see is that a lot of people are leaving companies because, and maybe I'm sensitive to it, but I'm a woman, but a lot of women are leaving companies because they don't have the right culture, right? And so that is a huge problem because we need this other half of the population. Like, we have a huge skilled worker shortage. And if we do not get women into the workforce, and they are looking more than men even for the right company and for the right workplace and, you know, something with a kind of a vision, then we have a problem in society generally. So this is something I work with an organization called Women in Climate Tech and Innovation. Like, it's really to opening up and to get founders on a table and say, look, you need to create an environment where women feel comfortable, they feel accepted, and there are different roads, you know, or different ways to achieve your goals. And by the way, which to loop it back to startups, women's startups are generally more profitable than male startups are. There's the statistics out there. This is a lot of times it's overseen by investors. So
thanks, Doreen.
Loop it in the other kind of direction. Sorry.
Yeah, no, absolutely. All viewpoints definitely wanted. And Milan, talking about a final kind of major barrier for scaling energy tech startups, specifically supply chain issues. How much does that affect kind of scaling potential, and how can that be overcome?
Well, I think it has affected, but currently it's not a big problem anymore. I think it has turned the other way around. So also because of COVID, there was of course a stagnation in production. But right now, what we see is that there's a big supply of production that is still waiting to be sold. So I think we just have the opposite problem, that we are oversupplied a bit. So right now, and we see it across all our countries, supply chain in that sense is not a problem anymore. So it's fortunately it is gone back to normal again.
Would you agree with that, Tim?
Probably in the case of Milan and Soly, yes. But if I would look at other components, for example, for bigger locations which need transformation stations because the power capacity needs to be expanded, there's still, I would say, problems in the supply chain which make or which cause delays in implementation times. And in the end, even in an oversupply situation, which we see maybe with components in the residential solar market right now, it can be challenging for scaling companies because it's always a business decision or a strategy decision on also internally a balance between supply and demand. So sales and when to source your products or when to source the resources you need to fulfill your services. And if you're, for example, rather on the safe side, risk-averse side, and you purchased a lot of components in the past to higher prices, and now due to the demand drop in single markets, you have issues to sell your products or your services to this high price with a higher margin, then you have also issues, right? So I would totally agree with Milan. Supply is much better for certain components, but still it can be challenging, and you need to find the right balance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Tim. And switching the topic a little bit now, Milan, how difficult is the process of expanding into new markets, for example, both within the EU and outside of the EU, in your case, South Africa?
Yeah, so indeed, leaving the bureaucracy behind, that's done. So
yeah,
I think what is challenging, because in the end, the solution we are providing is always the same in terms of assets, right? But the proposition you make around these assets that change quite a lot. For example, in South Africa, people buy solar and batteries because they want to have a secure on energy, because they encounter a lot of blackouts wherein they just cut off from energy. And for example, the business case we see over there, we talk with a big supermarket chain over there. They see that as soon as there is a blackout, it takes 20 seconds before the generator is being turned on. And in that 20 seconds, there is a lot of theft going on, of course. But if you have a battery in place, it's like a loss of maybe a second or something. And based on that, sometimes an entire business case is made. While, for example, if you compare it to the Netherlands, we still have net metering, so battery is not even required here. Is just a financial solution at itself. And in Germany, it can be a little bit different. So it's about finding the sweet spot on the proposition side. And then you, of course, also have your operational changes. For example, the first mistake we made in South Africa is that we installed solar oriented to the south instead of the north. Because it's, of course, on the other side of the equator. So that you always have these operational learnings as well. But mostly it involves making the right proposition for that end customer. And I can tell you that can change big time in terms of countries.
Thanks, Milan. And more generally, big question, Tim, but do you think it's more viable to saturate one market or to try and proliferate into many?
Tricky question, and as usually, I think it's impossible to give a left or right answer or to say yes or no. So, for example, if you have one target group with one target market, you have a nice focus, can be a nice strategy if that's in line with your goals. But if you have more risk appetite, if you want to grow fast, if you have the funding, if you have the technology, the team, you probably need to go to more markets. And with that, of course, risk increases because, as Milan said, these markets can be quite different. And if we look specifically into the energy industry, regulation is a big topic. It can be super diverse. So as soon as you expand into multiple markets at the same time, it's getting complex, most of the time also for products, especially, for example, also in our case, where it's about energy management and software, which need to be compliant with the regulation. But also on the other side, it gives you a hedge, right? So being in different markets, having different target groups, and not being dependent on one single market is also an advantage.
Makes sense. Nice. And Doreen, do you have anything to add there in your perspective and the companies that you've worked with?
No, but I agree with the fact that you should actually scale rather sooner than later. And it's especially when you're in Europe. I mean, America and whatever, Australia, South Africa is another game. But I would say if well, there's one experience that we had with a few startups that we work with is if you don't think about scaling right away into other markets, especially when you're in the regulatory field, you can have a problem because whatever your business model is before you go and start, you should check whether it's compatible with other markets because otherwise you're stuck with one market and then you have an issue. So that's the advice that we always give is check other markets and regulation first, whether your business model works there, and then obviously make your plan about expanding.
Thanks, Doreen. And Milan, obviously the energy industry is a global phenomenon. Everyone needs energy across the entire world. And how can we ensure that international cooperation ensures this growth of the solar energy industry in particular on a global level?
Yeah, I think that is also a relevant discussion we face right now. I think also on a company level, because what we have learned in the past years is you can strive towards having an international field, but it also comes with risk, right? We've all learned what risks there are if you are becoming dependent on certain countries for your energy supply. So I think the question is also, and I don't want to get political, but I think it is a dimension we also have to think about as a business owner, is do we want to create an energy system, a decentralized energy system in Europe that is merely based on assets that are coming from big companies from the Far East, for example? What risks are connected with that? Or maybe do we want to become, as a continent, a little bit more in control and make sure that we create an atmosphere where we can maybe produce our own assets? And of course, you are always dependent on some sources for on an international level. But I think right now we have learned our lessons, what an international playing field and international risk can bring us. And I think we have to reflect a little bit more on that and see how can we become a little bit more independent on a European level. And of course, it is merely a political discussion. But I think more and more businesses are also now thinking about this as a strategic topic.
Thanks, Milan. And owning in on digital transformation, Tim, obviously the energy industry is undergoing a huge digital transformation at the moment. What can we learn from maybe other industries that have already kind of further along in the process? And what sort of unique challenges does energy have?
Yeah, good question. So I think we can learn a lot from other industries and transformation in these industries. So if you take, for example, the telecommunication industry, there are lots of parallels. So looking, for example, the starting point where you have most of the time analog assets, turning that into an IoT approach. So where you have sensors in the field, where you have gateways in the field, we need to manage assets, right? And we need to process, transport, send, and store data connected to cloud architectures. I think that's something we massively need in the energy industry, and which was done in the telco industry before. And also a big thing we should hopefully learn faster is the whole topic of communication protocols, right? So standards, how to establish common languages between different devices. I think that's also something we can learn and do much, much better in the energy industry. So we don't have to invent the wheel completely new. That's good. On the other side, I would also say there are certain things which are quite unique. So we touched on that a little bit again already. So the regulatory framework, especially in Europe, the implementation of the framework makes it really complex. And this complexity, I would say, it's very unique. You also have other complex industries like healthcare, for example, but comparing that to telco, for example, it's much more hard to really have a common implementation of regulation where, for example, grid operator use cases, like Milan touched on in the beginning, are the same or almost the same in all European countries. It's definitely not the case right now.
Yeah. Doreen, we talked a little bit about skills before, but can you provide some insights into how countries can develop workforce skills to anticipate the future needs in the green and clean technology sector?
You mean develop skill sets for or for more employees, basically, or for solving the skilled labor shortage?
Yeah, basically. Yeah, upskilling, encouraging people to make the switch to the industry.
Well, salaries, funding, that's one thing. So we have to be equal. And I think also perspective, sort of future, so that what we see right now is there's a bit of a uncertainty when it comes to deep tech companies. I mean, with the whole IRA and the competition from Far East, which Milan mentioned as well, building up deep tech companies, which is what we need in Europe in order to, also referring to Milan, to be independent and to be independent, frankly, and not to rely our critical infrastructure, which we're doing right now, again, on a third country. So for that, we need certainty. And certainty means, it goes back to politics, we need frameworks that ensure that deep tech companies are able to be here in the long run, right? That they're able to compete. And I give you an example right now. I mean, look at the energy industry. Look at solar. Look at the modules that are coming in. They're really cheap. So on that basis, you're never going to build up a solar industry here ever again. It's not going to work. Okay, even if you fund 800 million or whatever for factories, they will still not be able to compete with the price competition that comes from Far East. We're seeing that right now in the US because they have heavy subsidies from the IRA, and still they are holding off right now with building those factories because they're not able to compete with the products that are coming in from China. So again, I think to attract people in deep tech and climate tech, you need a outlook, you need a future that means, yeah, they're going to sustain here in Europe, right? They're going to last, they're going to build, they're going to grow. I think in the digital space, we managed that and it's kind of working well. But when it comes to the deep tech and hardware component or industry, I mean, look at the automotive industries. You know, we're seeing cuts and layoffs en masse at the moment. I mean, it was for VW, somebody laid off quite a few people just the other day. It's because we didn't manage to keep up with the innovation. It's because we didn't manage to get the frameworks in order or in time in order to keep the industries here. So I think, to answer your question, and then a kind of a short sentence, it's frameworks, politics, and to provide the right frameworks so that companies stay within Europe and they see and they can grow here.
Milan, would you agree with that frameworks are really pivotal in kind of keeping industries here?
Yeah, definitely. But it is sometimes also tempting to wait before something is organized and then wait for that. I think there's also a level of leadership that is required from market leaders in that sense. So I think it has to go hand in hand. And to be honest, if you base your proposition based on price, you will also get in consumers that are looking for price, right? So you also attract then that kind of consumers. And in the end, if you look to us, for example, it is all about providing a solution that is not necessarily based on price only, but providing a solution that is future-proof, that has qualitative assets. We're a B Corp company, so we also have to align on certain topics ourselves. So sometimes we cannot even choose for the cheapest product. So I think there's also some leadership that is required from market leaders. So I think in the end it will go hand in hand.
Thanks, Tim. Any thoughts on this?
Maybe adding to what Doreen said, framework. So I think we are seeing many situations where we can, give short-term measures to improve situations and attract talent and workforce to the right industry, like the energy industry. But I think we also need to look at the long run. So also adapting education systems and adapting structures there, content there, to really have it in mind on a much earlier stage, what's having what kind of impact in the future when you choose jobs, for example. I think that's also something we should look at.
Thanks. And Milan, Tim already touched on it before in terms of digital transformation, but what sort of unique challenges do you see more generally in the energy industry, particularly in terms of scaling a company?
I think, to be honest, digitization is the key driver behind that. For example, what we have seen in the Netherlands, and of course, my perspective is always solar. So I'm sorry for that. I think you can have multiple perspectives, but I have the solar fibers. So, but what we have seen, for example, in the Netherlands, I think the biggest driver behind the success of Soly is also the fact that we originated from the Netherlands. Is that already 25% of all the households have solar in place. Solar is already a commodity product in the Netherlands. And what we've seen when you have a commodity product, then you have a lot of players in that field, and you are challenged to really be extremely lean in terms of pricing to stay competitive. And we have made a decision to build our own platform in-house to make our organization as lean as possible. When we then entered the German market at the start of this year, we got the question by consumers that received a quote that they stated, is there a catch? Because the price is so low, it just doesn't make sense. So we aesthetically had to higher our margins to become more trustworthy towards customer. What we see right now in Germany is that also solar has become more and more a commodity. And I think if you compare prices of this quarter compared to the first quarter of this year, you will see a massive drop already. And you can only do that if you have a very efficient and lean digitized process. And I think what you will see is that the German market will mature very fast in that sense, because there are already some mature players that are now, sometimes they have to retrofit the digital platform, but sometimes they already have something in place that will make it extremely difficult for the smaller installers to get at the same level of efficiency. So I think you will see a big a majority of the market, especially next year in the German market, for example. So yeah, digitization is I think, if I look to my own company, I think it is maybe the key driver behind the scalability.
I guess you'd probably agree with that, right, Tim?
I would agree, yeah. And I think a good portion of the digital maturity of Milan's company would also be quite favorable, for example, for the grid area. So as the energy industry is very infrastructure heavy, there's always the question, how much copper do you need to put where and when? So that's a huge challenge, I would say. But if you put as much digitalization and smartness as possible into that riddle, I think that's much better for our economy.
And Doreen, do you have any more examples of kind of digitalization challenges in the wider climate tech space?
No, except that I see digitalization as a basis for a lot of the transition, because we cannot transition to a renewable or green energy system without, any digital tool. So that and by the way, when you talk broader climate tech, for example, when we go away a little bit from the energy system, if you look at the plastics area. We all want to get rid of plastics, right? Or at least have plastics not turn up in the environment, because we won't get rid of plastics for a while. But what's needed for that is that we have proper recycling systems, that we really turn plastics around more often and we reuse it, right? And that is not possible right now because there's no system in place. So what we need is a fully digitalization of the recycling as well as the plastics industry, all the companies from Nestle and Co. who use it for their products. Because if you do not kind of know how much is out there, where is it being recycled, at what quality, and who needs how much in the end to reuse it in whatever they're manufacturing, there is no chance. Right now, that industry is working on fact basis, right? So this is where we stand. And this just gives you an example. I think the energy industry is already a bit more advanced, but this gives you an example how we need digitalization in order to even get to like a greener kind of economy and to turn around the transition.
Thanks. The energy industry is already a bit more advanced. It's definitely what we want to hear. Although, obviously, need to advance other industries at the same time. Doreen, you've talked a bit about frameworks and how crucial they are. Can you go into a little bit more detail about what sort of frameworks you mean that can support expanding companies?
Well, I'm going in the solar industry right now, Milan. I'm sure you're with me on that. There is a big, I don't know if you how familiar you are with the German discussion right now, but there's a big discussion right now about how can we establish a regional, and I guess that's not German, but it's generally European solar industry again, so that we're not diving from one dependence, which was Russian gas, into another one, which is the solar industry, and being dependent completely 98% on components from Far East, which could be a massive problem for us in a few years. And that's tricky because, as I said before, by just funding, hundreds of millions of euros into factories is not going to cut it, because you're not going to compete, not with our democratic standards, not with maternity leave, not with a 5-day week, not with a 40-hour week, not with all the social stuff that we have. You will never able to compete with anything that comes out of China that is potentially produced, under conditions that are not so fair, or even worse if it's produced under forced labor conditions, right? So we have an issue. And how do you solve that? To be honest, I don't know. There are lots of solutions on the agenda right now that are being discussed on political level. But you know what, I'm just taking the solar industry as an example. Like, that goes for every industry. It's the same for the car industry. It doesn't matter if you need a part for car production, or if you need something for energy. It's if we cannot guarantee same standards or a competition of products produced under the same standards, at which point, if you let in products, or you want to guarantee that everything is on the same standards, then very likely the products coming from other countries will have to have a higher price as well if they produce them under the same standards that we have, right? So at that point, we have an issue again, because then if you take the example of the solar industry, you have all the installers complaining about the fact that the module prices or the storage prices or whatever go up, and that it's not cost efficient anymore to build solar or storage or whatever, right? Because prices are going up. So we have to find a way how this can work, and how it can work that we that we build up an industry, right, that is cost competitive with the rest of the world, either by putting up right frameworks, or, and that is the other way to go, is to really invest heavily in innovation and development, like R&D, right, research and development. So if we come up with new innovative stuff that is advanced from what other countries and other regions are having, and then we can compete again, because we're ahead of the game, right? So we have to basically look at two things. There's one, at frameworks, what can we do? What is feasible with international law and with international standards? And the other one is to really, really push innovation and finance innovation, because it's the only way we will be able to sustain an industry kind of nation.
Thanks, Doreen. We're actually over time, but we've just had a question from the audience, so really going to quickly go into that. Milan, I might direct this to you. Supply chain transparency regulation is a big focus of the EU, as far as I know, says the person. Isn't that going to solve competition issues? What do you think about that?
It's almost getting political. You ask an entrepreneur. So maybe to cover it from my perspective, and let's see if that answers the question. So I think we have a reality check to make, right? So we can try to get control of our direct supply chain. But for example, in the Netherlands, they opened up a manufacture site for solar, and that solar production cannot even account for the entire demand we have in a year. So the demand we have is way higher compared to the amount of solar we could produce in Europe in short notice. So it's all about phasing in and phasing out. What we do have is we have an example in the Netherlands where we had a mobile phone brand, and I'm sure, and I know they also produce inverters, and they were associated with some data protection topics. And then the Dutch government decided, okay, we don't want to sell these kind of mobile phones anymore, and they were getting out of the market. The question is, and it turned out to become a geopolitical topic. The question is, what is the risk as an entrepreneur you want to take? For example, if you're now building big virtual power plants and based on assets that might in the end create a geopolitical risk, is that then a good decision you want to make? And those are strategic decisions I am well aware that entrepreneurs that have a certain impact on this industry are now considering. So in the end, transparency that sometimes pops up in a certain supply chain can indeed lead to changes being made on the governmental, but sometimes also on an entrepreneurial level. So yeah, it might be a driver of behind pivoting to a more independent European production chain.
Thanks, Milan. Any final words on that, Tim?
Yeah, I think the question was also about the competition issue. So I think in general, competition is not an issue, it's necessary. But of course, we have issues at current competition levels with that regard. So I think initiatives like this new legislation can help to make competition more fair by setting certain standards which should be there worldwide. On the other side, we will never have worldwide global equality with regards to environments and circumstances. And I think that's also good, right? So we want to have a diverse world. It has lots of advantages, but to have free markets, free trade, and as less hidden subsidies as possible and common standards, I think that's very healthy for competition. And yeah, big wish from my side.
Thank you. That brings us, unfortunately, to the end of the session. So thank you so much for closing the day on such an interesting discussion. And we will be back tomorrow delving into the topic of solar a little bit more at 10:30. Thanks again, Doreen, Milan. Thank you, Tim. Thank you so much to the viewers today for asking questions, for taking part, for watching. We definitely enjoyed our first day of gridXdays. So thank you, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Bye, Milan, Doreen. Thanks, Greta.
Thanks, Greta. Bye.